Hello, Night Seekers, and welcome to Lacuna Noir. This is where forgotten stories and gentle voices meet, carrying you softly into peaceful sleep, wrapped in mystery. Before tonight's stories begin, I'd love to know, where in the world are you listening from? Drop a comment below and let me know. And a little note before we begin. You may notice a few brief ads in the first 10 minutes, but after that, the rest of the video is completely ad-free. Just you, the silence, and the stories. So settle in, get comfortable, and let the night carry you. If you're drawn to these quiet, shadowed nights, don't forget to like, subscribe, and tap the bell so you never miss a story when darkness calls. It was the middle of summer 2 years ago, one of those heavy nights where the air feels thick even with the windows open. I had fallen asleep easily, the kind of deep, peaceful sleep that comes after a long, hot day. The fan was humming softly in the corner, and outside everything was still. No wind, no cars, no voices, just that quiet suburban calm that makes you forget anything bad could ever happen. I don't know how long I'd been asleep when the first thunderclap hit. It wasn't normal thunder. It wasn't the distant rolling kind you hear during a storm that's miles away. This sounded like the sky had cracked open directly over my house. The noise was so violent that it felt physical. My entire bed jolted. The windows rattled. For a split second, I honestly thought something had exploded. My heart jumped straight into my throat, and I shot upright in bed, completely disoriented. The house shook in a way I'd never felt before. Not a gentle vibration, but a deep shudder that rolled through the floor and up into my chest. I remember grabbing the mattress like that would somehow steady the building. My first thought wasn't thunder. My first thought was earthquake. It felt that big. I sat there in the dark, listening, waiting for something else to happen. The fan was still running. The power was still on. Nothing smelled like smoke. Slowly, my brain started to catch up with the reality. A storm. It had to be a storm. Even then, I'd never heard thunder that loud in my life. After a minute or two, when nothing else happened, I lay back down. My pulse was still racing, but I told myself it was just a freak thunderclap. Summer storms get intense sometimes. I pulled the sheet back over my shoulder and forced my breathing to slow. Eventually, the quiet crept back in. No rain yet. No wind. Just silence again. Like the world was holding its breath. I must have drifted off because the next thing I knew, I was ripped awake again. This time it wasn't just sound, it was light. A blinding flash burst through my window, turning my entire room bright purple for a fraction of a second. Not white lightning, purple. The color burned into my vision like a camera flash. At the exact same moment, thunder crashed so violently that I felt it in my teeth. It wasn't a crack or a boom. It was a tearing, roaring blast that swallowed every other sound. I actually flinched and curled in on myself, hands over my head. It felt like the strike had landed inside the room. For a heartbeat, I couldn't hear anything but a high ringing in my ears. My chest was tight, like all the air had been punched out of me. And then the screaming started. At first, I thought it was part of the thunder echoing. Some strange distortion rolling across the neighborhood. But it didn't fade. It grew. High-pitched, raw animal shrieks poured in through my open window. There were multiple voices overlapping, rising and falling in waves. It sounded like dozens of creatures crying out at once. The closest thing I can compare it to is a choir, but twisted, not singing, screaming. Long, ragged wails that rose into sharp, desperate screeches. It didn't sound human, but it didn't sound like anything I recognized as an animal either. It sounded wrong, like something ancient and panicked. I froze in bed. Every horror movie I'd ever seen piled into my brain at once. My room was dark again, except for faint lightning flickering behind the curtains. Each flash lit the ceiling for a split second, and every time it did, the screams were still there. Constant, agonized, right outside my window. My thoughts spiraled immediately. Something is happening. Something is outside. Something terrible. I remember thinking, with complete seriousness, this is it. This is how the world ends. Not in fire or explosions, but in whatever nightmare is happening out there. It felt like reality had torn open, and I was hearing something I wasn't meant to hear. The screams weren't random. They moved. Sometimes closer, sometimes farther, circling. I could picture shapes running through the yard, even though I couldn't see anything. My imagination filled in shadows with monsters. Every rustle of leaves sounded like footsteps. Every lightning flash threatened to reveal something standing at the window. I didn't dare get up. I didn't dare look. My entire body was locked in that helpless state between fight and flight where you do neither. My muscles were tense, ready to move, but I couldn't command them. I just lay there staring at the dark outline of my ceiling, listening to the chaos outside. My heart beat so hard it hurt. Another blast of thunder rolled overhead, not as sharp as the first, but deep and heavy. The screams spiked again in response, louder than before. They overlapped into a wall of sound that made my skin crawl. There was a wildness in it, pure terror and confusion. Whatever was making those noises was afraid. That realization didn't comfort me. It made it worse. If something that sounded like that was afraid, what could possibly be scaring it? Time stretched in a strange way. It could have been 30 seconds or 5 minutes. I had no sense of it. I only knew I was trapped in that bed, listening to what felt like the soundtrack of the apocalypse. I remember whispering to myself over and over, "It's just a storm. It's just a storm," like a child trying to ward off a nightmare. Gradually, the thunder moved farther away. The flashes came less often. The screaming started to thin out. Individual cries broke away from the chorus until there were only a few scattered wails, then silence. Real silence. The kind that presses in on your ears after overwhelming noise. I lay there shaking, waiting for it to start again. It didn't. Eventually, rain began to fall, soft at first, then steady. The normal, comforting sound of rainfall replaced the horror show. My breathing slowly returned to something close to normal. Exhaustion crept in behind the fading adrenaline. I must have fallen asleep again because the next thing I remember is waking up to gray morning light. For a few seconds, I thought I'd dreamed the whole thing. It felt too surreal to be real. My room looked ordinary. The fan was still humming. Sunlight filtered through the curtains. The birds were chirping like nothing had happened. Then I remembered the purple lightning, the screaming, the way my house had shaken. I got up and checked outside. The yard was wet but intact. No trees down. No scorch marks. No sign that the sky had tried to tear itself apart a few hours earlier. The neighborhood looked completely normal. It was almost insulting how calm everything seemed. Later that day, I mentioned it to a neighbor, asking if they'd heard the storm. Their eyes lit up immediately. They started laughing and said something like, "Yeah, those foxes went crazy last night." Foxes. Apparently, a pack of them lives in the wooded area not far from our street. When lightning gets close, they panic and start screaming. I'd never heard foxes before. Not like that. I'd heard dogs howl, cats yowl, coyotes yip in the distance. None of it sounded like what I'd heard. I went home and looked up recordings out of curiosity. The moment I hit play, my stomach dropped. That was it, that exact sound. The same rising, human-like shrieks that had frozen me in bed. Knowing what it was didn't erase the memory of fear. If anything, it made me respect how primal that reaction had been. In the safety of daylight, it was almost funny. A bunch of terrified foxes screaming at thunder had convinced me the end of the world was happening outside my window. But at 3 in the morning, half awake, with purple lightning burning through the dark, it had felt absolutely real. My brain hadn't processed wildlife. It had processed something is terribly wrong. Even now, when storms roll in at night, I sometimes think about that moment. The way sound alone can hijack your sense of reality. The way fear fills in blanks with monsters faster than logic ever can. If I hear a strange noise in the dark, there's still a tiny part of me that flashes back to that bed, that thunder, that choir of screaming voices. I laugh about it now. I tell the story, and people joke about demon foxes and angry gods throwing lightning bolts. But in that moment, lying there in the dark, I had never felt so small or so sure that I was hearing something beyond my understanding. It was just animals, just weather, nothing supernatural, nothing mystical. And it was still one of the most terrifying nights of my life. Two decades later, I can still see that stretch of highway, like it's frozen in a photograph. It's strange what the brain decides to keep. I've forgotten entire semesters of school, names of teachers, birthdays, addresses, but that road, that night, and that man stepping out of the woods are locked in my memory with uncomfortable clarity. I was 16. Riding the thin line between kid and adult, the way you do at that age. I old enough to feel independent, but young enough that everything still felt slightly unreal. We were coming back from Kings Island after a full day of roller coasters, fried food, and sun. The kind of day that leaves your body exhausted, but your mind buzzing. It was late. The sky had that deep navy color that only shows up after midnight, when the world feels emptied out, and the highway becomes a tunnel through darkness. We had crossed back into Indiana not long before. Traffic was light, just the occasional pair of headlights rushing past in the opposite direction. The road cut through long stretches of woods, the trees pressing in close on both sides. I remember leaning my head against the window, watching the black shapes of the forest slide by, thinking how endless it looked. At night, woods don't look like nature. They look like a wall, a place where anything could stand 10 feet in and you'd never see it. We were talking lazily, the way people do when they're tired but don't want to sleep yet. Half sentences, jokes that didn't fully land, music low on the radio. The air in the car smelled like sunscreen and spilled soda. It felt safe in that seal-off way cars do at night, like the outside world couldn't touch us, as long as the doors were locked and the engine kept humming. That's when I saw a movement ahead. At first, it was just a shape detaching itself from the tree line. Something pale against the dark. My brain tried to categorize it automatically. Deer. Dog. Someone's shirt caught in the headlights. As we got closer, the shape stepped fully out of the woods and onto the shoulder of the highway. It was a man. That realization came in pieces. The height first, then the posture, then the unmistakable outline of a human body. He stood there facing the road, illuminated in the yellow sweep of our headlights, and he was completely naked. For a second, my brain refused to process it. How there's a special kind of shock that comes from seeing something so out of place that it feels staged, like a prank or a movie set. A naked man on the side of a rural highway at night didn't belong in the catalog of things that happen in real life. But there he was. As we drew closer, more details snapped into focus, each one worse than the last. He was middle-aged, not young, not elderly. His body was pale and thin in the harsh light, skin almost glowing. Around his neck hung a heavy chain that rested against his chest. Not a necklace, a chain. Thick, industrial-looking, the kind you'd use to secure something large. It caught the headlights and flashed metallic. And covering his face was a mask. It wasn't a Halloween mask with colors or features. It was smooth and tight, latex stretched over his head. No hair visible, no skin. Just the blank, artificial sheen of rubber. The eye holes were dark. From a distance, it gave him the appearance of not having a face at all. Just a human body topped with a featureless shell. He didn't wave. He didn't step into the road. He didn't try to flag us down. He simply stood there at the edge of the trees, angled slightly toward us, like he had just emerged and paused. Waiting. The car went quiet. I don't remember anyone saying his name or asking him what the hell we were seeing. There was just this shared intake of breath, a collective freeze. Time stretched. The headlights washed over him fully, and for a fraction of a second he was perfectly lit, every detail sharp. The mask, the chain, the nakedness, the stillness. Then we passed him. He turned his head as we went by, slowly, following the car with that blank face. I could feel his gaze even though I couldn't see his eyes. It crawled along my skin like static. I twisted in my seat to look back through the rear window. He was still standing there. The red glow of our taillights painted him in a dull halo as he shrank into the distance. He didn't chase. He didn't retreat into the woods. He remained planted at the edge of the highway, a silent figure in the dark, until the road curved and swallowed him. No one spoke for several seconds. The car felt smaller, the air heavier. Finally, someone let out a shaky laugh and said something like, "What the hell was that?" But it wasn't a real laugh. It was the kind you make when your brain is scrambling to file something under humor, because the alternative is fear. We started talking over each other, trying to rationalize it instantly. Maybe he was drunk. Maybe it was a dare. Maybe he was on drugs. Maybe there was a party in the woods. Each explanation sounded thinner than the last. What stuck with me wasn't just the nudity or the mask. It was the location. That stretch of highway wasn't near a town. There were no houses visible, no gas stations, no lights beyond the occasional passing car. Just miles of trees. The idea of someone being out there alone, emerging from that darkness dressed like that, suggested a backstory I didn't want to imagine. At 16, I didn't fully grasp the danger. It registered as bizarre more than threatening. I remember thinking, in a detached way, that it would make a funny story to tell friends. My teenage brain filed it under weird roadside encounter and moved on. We kept driving. The radio volume crept back up. Conversation resumed, but it felt forced, like we were all pretending the moment had already faded. It didn't fade. Over the next few days, the image kept resurfacing at random times. In class, in the shower, lying in bed. The mask was what haunted me most. And there's something deeply unsettling about a covered face. Humans read emotion from features automatically. Take that away, and you're left with a void. He wasn't a man in my memory anymore. He was a silhouette wearing a human shape. I started replaying the scene with new questions. Where had he come from? How long had he been standing in those woods before we saw him? Was he waiting for a specific car? Had someone else stopped? The thought that always hit me hardest was the simplest one. We were not the first people to pass that spot that night. Highways are constant rivers. Cars flow through them every minute. If he chose that location deliberately, he must have known someone would see him eventually, which meant the sight of us wasn't a surprise to him. It was the point. Years later, as an adult, the memory changed flavor. What felt absurd at 16 feels darker now. I think about vulnerability differently. About how exposed you are on a road at night. About how thin the barrier is between a moving car and the wilderness around it. Seeing him as a kid was like spotting a glitch in reality. Seeing him now, in hindsight, it feels like brushing against a story I'm glad I never learned the ending to. I've driven that route since then. Not often, but enough times that I've passed stretches of woods that look eerily similar. Every time, some part of me scans the tree line automatically. I imagine headlights catching pale skin again. A figure stepping forward. That blank mask turning toward me. Nothing has ever been there. Most likely he was a disturbed man doing something that only made sense inside his own head. Maybe he was in the middle of a breakdown. Maybe it was a fetish taken to a dangerous extreme. Maybe there were other people in the woods we couldn't see, watching the highway like he was. The possibilities branch out endlessly, and none of them land comfortably. What unsettles me most is how close we were to stopping. Not physically, but psychologically. There's a version of that night where teenage curiosity wins, where we slow down, roll down a window, ask if he needs help. That version of the story ends in ways I don't like to explore for long. At 16, I didn't call the police because I didn't understand that I had just seen something that crossed the line from weird into potentially dangerous. To me, it was a roadside oddity, a story to laugh about. Now, older, I wish I had made the call. Not because I think I could have saved him from himself, but because he was a human being alone in the woods, wearing a mask and a chain in the middle of the night. That's not a neutral situation. That's a red flare in the dark. But memory is a closed loop. You don't get to step back into it and choose differently. All that remains is the image. Headlights cutting through darkness, trees parting, and a man stepping into view like he'd been waiting there forever. Sometimes the world shows you something that doesn't fit your map of how things are supposed to work. A tiny tear in the fabric. You keep driving, life resumes, years stack up on top of it. But that tear never fully closes. It just sits there in your memory, whispering that the woods are deeper than they look and the night holds more stories than you'll ever hear explained. And somewhere in that stretch of Indiana highway, if you drive it late enough and the road is empty and the trees lean in close, it's easy to imagine a figure still standing at the edge of the light, waiting for the next pair of headlights to find him. Working nights already stretches your nerves thin. Everything is quieter than it should be. Every sound feels louder, and your brain has too much empty space to fill in the gaps. Add responsibility for 15 sleeping teenagers, and an old house that creaks like it has opinions, and it's the perfect recipe for a night that crawls under your skin and refuses to leave. I had been at the program long enough that the routine felt automatic. 2 staff on 3rd shift, split into 4-hour blocks. One upstairs walking the bedrooms, one downstairs keeping the lights on, and the paperwork breathing. We traded places halfway through. Most nights were uneventful in a way that almost felt suspicious. The scariest thing was usually a girl trying to sneak a phone call or raid the snack cabinet. It was work you could do half asleep. That Thursday started like any other. I came in, did the usual small talk, signed what needed signing, and wandered toward the stairs. The house was an old duplex that had been opened up, so the layout was symmetrical in a way that made you feel like you were walking through a mirror. 2 living rooms, 2 staircases, everything doubled. Old wood, old doors, old sounds. As I headed upstairs, I noticed the sliding door to the living room on my side was partially closed. That alone was weird. The door was huge and heavy, the kind that fights you every inch of the way. It screeched when it moved. Nobody touched it unless they absolutely had to. Seeing it half shut felt like walking into a room and finding a chair turned toward you. I paused, looked at it for a second, and shrugged it off. Old houses do odd things. People do absent-minded things. I went upstairs, sat in my usual spot, and opened my laptop. The girls were asleep. I did my room checks like clockwork, every half hour, watching the soft rise and fall of blankets, listening to the steady breathing that told me everything was normal. Around 1 in the morning, I decided I needed a drink. I went downstairs, already thinking about how cold the soda would be, and stopped short in the hallway. The sliding door was now completely closed. My first thought was that my coworker had gone in there to nap and shut it against the light. But I hadn't heard it. That door didn't close quietly. It announced itself to the entire house. Still, I didn't want to risk waking her. She was not a gentle person at 1 in the morning. I grabbed my drink, told myself I was overthinking it, and went back upstairs. At 1:30, the crash came. It wasn't a subtle thump or a dropped object. It was a full-bodied, house-shaking bang from the first floor. The kind of noise that jerks you upright before your brain catches up. I called out, asking my coworker if it was her. Her voice floated back from the opposite side of the house, confused and sharp. No. We both started moving. I checked the bedrooms first, heart already beating faster than I wanted to admit. Every girl was in bed, no one pretending, no one halfway to the door. My coworker swept the first floor and came back with the same answer. Nothing. All 4 doors locked. No broken glass, no overturned furniture. Just silence settling back in like dust. That should have calmed me down. Instead, it made everything worse. A loud noise with no source is harder to file away than a problem you can point at. I started doing room checks every 10 or 15 minutes, irregular on purpose. If someone was playing games and had memorized the schedule, I wanted to catch them. While I was on one side of the house, I heard footsteps on the other. Clear as day. Someone walking with weight behind it. I crossed over fast, ready to drag a kid back to bed. They were all asleep, not pretending, not stirring. I asleep in that heavy way that doesn't fake well. The air in the hallway felt thick. I stood there listening to nothing, feeling stupid and angry and unsettled all at once. At 3, we switched. I came downstairs wound tight and found my coworker in the office looking at me strangely. She asked if I'd locked the snack cabinet and the staff fridge. I hadn't. She told me she'd left them open on purpose because she'd been going in and out all night. They were closed. We stared at each other for a second that stretched too long. I asked her about the living room. She swore she hadn't been in there, hadn't touched the door, hadn't heard it move. I felt the blood drain out of my face in a way that was almost physical, like stepping off a curb you didn't see. That's when my brain stopped flirting with ghost stories and landed hard on a different fear. Someone was in the house. We were in the middle of a city. Break-ins weren't unheard of. The idea that a stranger could be moving quietly through the first floor while we were upstairs with 15 kids made my stomach twist. I checked the doors again. One of the front doors was unlocked. That was enough. I told my coworker to stay in the office, and I went to the living room. Every step toward that sliding door felt like walking toward a dare. I pushed it open slowly, bracing myself for anything. A person curled on the couch, someone standing in the corner, a face turning toward me. The room was empty. The light was on. It had been off earlier. I knew it had. I stood there in the doorway, listening to the buzz of the bulb and the sound of my own breathing. The windows were closed, nothing disturbed. It looked like a normal room, which somehow made it worse. We searched the first floor together, then the second, every bed accounted for, every hallway empty. My coworker started praying under her breath, words spilling out faster and faster. I sat on the couch and tried to anchor myself to something solid. The fabric under my hands, the hum of electricity, the idea that there had to be an explanation that didn't involve the house deciding to wake up. But the noises kept coming. Soft movement upstairs, a shift, a step. Every time we checked, the girls were asleep. At one point, I crossed the landing between the staircases and caught a glimpse of a man standing above me out of the corner of my eye. Tall, still, watching. My body reacted before my brain did. I jumped and turned fully. There was nothing there. That shook me more than any sound. Not because I thought I'd seen a ghost, but because I realized how far my nerves had stretched. My mind was starting to supply its own horrors. When the day shifter came in around 5:30, relief hit me so hard it almost made me dizzy. I let her settle in, clinging to the normalcy of her routine. At 6:30, I walked in to tell her about the night, ready to unload everything. She beat me to it. She asked which client was awake and crying with my coworker at the top of the stairs. The words landed wrong. No one was awake. No one was crying. My coworker was downstairs. I told her that and watched her face change. Then I told her the rest. The door, the crash, the footsteps, the light. We were still talking when we all heard it. Someone moving in the kitchen. Clear, deliberate steps. The three of us moved at the same time. One ran upstairs to check beds. Two of us went for the kitchen from opposite sides, meeting in the middle with our hearts in our throats. Empty. By 7, the sun was up, light pouring in through the windows like nothing had happened. The house looked small and harmless in daylight. I left as fast as I could without actually running. The air outside felt like freedom. I told myself over and over that there had to be a rational explanation. Someone sneaking in. A lock that didn't catch. Old pipes. Old wood. Old wiring conspiring with exhaustion and imagination. That version of the story is the one I still choose to believe. It's the only one that lets me sleep. But even now, when I think about that night, I remember the feeling more than the events. The sense of being watched by something you can't locate. The way the house felt occupied by a presence that never fully showed itself. Not a monster, not a ghost, just an intrusion. A wrongness. I went back the next week and everything was normal. And no doors moving on their own. No phantom footsteps. The house returned to being just a building full of tired kids and tired staff. Life closed over the crack. Still, there are nights when a sound wakes me from sleep, and for half a second, I'm back on that landing, looking up and expecting to see a figure standing there. And even knowing it was probably a person, probably something mundane and solvable, that memory carries the same chill. Because whatever the cause, for one long shift in an old duplex, the world felt thin. And once you felt that, even briefly, it's hard to forget how fragile normal can be. The first week of July in 2011 is still burned into my memory. as the most unsettling stretch of nights I've ever lived through. Even now, years later, I can remember the feeling in the air as clearly as if I were standing back in that room. It started quietly, almost small enough to ignore, but it built night after night into something that made my own house feel hostile. The first night didn't seem like a big deal at all. I went into my bedroom like I always did, tired and ready to sleep. The moment I stepped inside, I noticed my closet door was open. That alone wasn't strange. What stopped me was the smell coming from inside. It hit me immediately, sharp and sour. The closest thing I can compare it to is cat urine, but stronger and more rotten, like it had been sealed up and fermenting. We didn't have a cat. Nothing in my closet could have made that smell. I stood there for a minute, covering my nose, trying to figure out if something had spilled or died in there. I flicked on the light and looked inside. Clothes, shoes, boxes, everything normal. No stains, no mess, no animal. The smell was just there, hanging in the air. I grabbed a can of Febreze from the hallway and sprayed the closet until I couldn't smell anything else. I shut the door hard, almost annoyed, like slamming it would end the problem. Once the scent faded, the room felt normal again. I crawled into bed and fell asleep without thinking much more about it. The second night was different from the moment I walked in. I hadn't even laid down yet when I felt it. The air felt heavy, like the pressure had changed. There was a weight in the room that made my shoulders tense. Then the smell came back, just as strong as the night before, seeping out from the closet even though the door was closed. The temperature didn't change, but my skin prickled like I was standing near electricity. It's hard to explain, but the air felt static, hot, and uncomfortable. I stood there frozen, listening. The room was silent, but it felt occupied. Something moved in the corner of my vision. I turned my head slowly and saw a shape crouched in the far corner of the room. It was darker than the shadows around it, like a stain in the darkness. It didn't have features, no face, no edges I could define. But I had the overwhelming feeling it was looking straight at me. We stared at each other for what felt like several seconds. I couldn't breathe. Then, just as suddenly as it appeared, it was gone. I didn't see it fade. It didn't step away. It just wasn't there anymore. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but I was rooted to the floor. When I finally moved, I dove into bed and pulled the covers up, heart hammering. I lay there staring at the ceiling, every muscle locked, waiting for something else to happen. Eventually, exhaustion dragged me under. The third night escalated fast. I had barely been in bed 5 minutes when the presence returned. That's the only word I have for it. Presence. The room felt crowded. The smell rolled in again, thicker than before. Then I heard scratching from inside the closet. It was soft at first, a dragging, scraping sound like fingernails on wood. I sat up instantly. The scratching came in short bursts, followed by a low sound that sat somewhere between a growl and a laugh. It wasn't loud, but it was close, too close. I snapped on the light and jumped out of bed. The noise stopped. My hands were shaking as I crossed the room and yanked the closet door open. Nothing. The air inside smelled normal. My clothes hung still. The metal folding chair I kept in the corner was exactly where I'd left it. I stood there staring, waiting for something to move, but everything was dead quiet. After a long minute, I shut the door and crawled back into bed. I don't know how I fell asleep so quickly, but fear has a way of exhausting you. Sometime during the night, I half woke to a metallic squeak. It slid into my dream and back out again, and I didn't fully register it until morning. When I opened my eyes, the chair from my closet was standing right next to my bed, not tipped over, not fallen. It had been placed there, carefully propped up, facing me. My stomach dropped so hard it felt like I'd missed a step on the stairs. I stared at that chair for a long time, trying to force logic into the situation. Maybe I moved it and forgot. Maybe I sleepwalked. But deep down, I knew I hadn't touched it. The idea that something had been close enough to my bed to set it there while I slept made my skin crawl. I shoved the chair back into the closet, slammed the door, and left my room. I didn't go back in until I absolutely had to. That night, I refused to sleep. I turned on every light and sat on my bed with my laptop, pretending I was just staying up late by choice. The house was quiet. My parents were asleep. Every creak made my shoulders jump. I kept checking the clock, counting minutes. At exactly 3:13 a.m., a single bang exploded against my bedroom door. It wasn't a knock. It was a slam. Loud, hollow, and violent. My dog in the next room started barking immediately, frantic and sharp. That's the part that locked it in as real. It wasn't in my head. She heard it too. I opened the door slowly. The hallway was empty. My parents' room was closed. I could hear steady snoring from down the hall. No footsteps, no retreating movement, just silence. I shut the door and didn't sleep at all. By the fifth day, I was running on fumes. I couldn't face my bedroom anymore, so I crashed on the couch. When I finally slept, I had a nightmare so vivid it felt like another memory. In the dream, an owl sat outside the window staring straight at me. Its eyes were locked onto mine. I couldn't look away no matter how hard I tried. Panic built until I woke drenched in sweat, heart racing like I'd been running. Later that night, around 10:30, I was in the den on the computer. My parents were asleep again. I got up to go downstairs for a smoke. The moment I stepped into the hallway, I heard the unmistakable creak of someone walking across the upstairs landing. There's a specific board that pops when you step on it. I'd heard it 1,000 times. I looked left, expecting to see my mom heading to the bathroom. Instead, I saw the shadow. It was the same shape from my room, darker than everything around it. This time, it was moving straight at me, fast. There was no time to think. Pure adrenaline took over. I swung at it as hard as I could. My fist cut through empty air. The shock of hitting nothing sent a bolt of terror through me. I ran downstairs, grabbed a kitchen knife, and stood there shaking, listening for footsteps. The house was silent again. I slowly, after what felt like forever, the heavy feeling lifted. The air felt normal. The smell was gone. I slept on the couch with the knife within reach. The sixth morning, my mom woke me before work. It was still dark outside. My brother had slept at a friend's house, so once she left, I was alone. I poured cereal and sat in front of the TV, trying to enjoy the quiet. Less than 20 minutes later, the presence flooded the living room. The smell hit me first, stronger than ever. It was suffocating. The air thickened like before, pressing in from all sides. I felt anger rise up so suddenly it surprised me. I was exhausted, scared, and done. I stood up, turned toward the darkest corner of the room where the feeling seemed to be coming from, and screamed at the top of my lungs, "Get the fuck out of here!" My voice echoed through the house. The pressure vanished instantly. The smell evaporated like someone had opened a window to another world. The room felt light, empty, mine again. I stood there breathing hard, waiting for it to come back. It never did. From that moment on, the house was normal. My bedroom felt safe again. The closet never smelled. The shadow never returned. It was like the entire week had been cut out of reality and sealed off. I didn't tell anyone for about a week. It sounded insane even in my own head. Then some friends started talking about ghost hunting, and the story spilled out. My brother was there listening. Halfway through, he stopped me. He told me he'd seen the same dark shape in his bathroom, directly across from his bedroom. He said it would stand there staring at him, and he'd feel paralyzed, unable to move. Then he mentioned the smell, that same sour, piss-like odor. Hearing that shook me more than the experiences themselves. It meant I hadn't imagined it. Whatever had been in that house hadn't chosen just me. Nothing like it has happened since. The memory still gives me chills, but it also left me with a strange kind of confidence. Fear fed whatever that thing was. The only moment it truly stopped was when I stopped being afraid and met it with pure rage. As ridiculous as it sounds, that's the lesson that stuck with me. Sometimes the only thing you can do in the face of something you don't understand is plant your feet, raise your voice, and refuse to give it space. And for reasons I'll probably never understand, that was enough to send whatever was haunting my house straight out the door. I spent a lot of time in my grandmother's old house when I was a kid. Even now, I can picture it perfectly, like a photograph that never faded. It was a tall, narrow, three-story place tucked deep in the woods, far enough from the road that the trees swallowed most of the sound of passing cars. The house always looked tired. The paint peeled in long curls from the siding. The porch sagged slightly in the middle, and many of the floorboards inside creaked like they were complaining about every step. Nothing in that house was straight anymore. The doorways leaned at odd angles from years of settling, and the floors sloped just enough that marbles would slowly roll on their own if you dropped them. As a kid, I didn't have the language to describe structural aging, but I could feel that the house was old in a way that went beyond appearances. It felt like it remembered things. I was about 10 at the time, and I had a wild imagination that needed very little encouragement. I had just discovered Stephen King and was devouring every horror story I could get my hands on. My head was full of haunted hotels, cursed rooms, and houses that hid secrets in their walls. Spending long days in a crooked old building in the middle of the woods was probably the worst possible environment for a kid like me, but I loved it anyway. I stayed with my grandmother during the day while my parents worked. The house had a quiet rhythm. The clock ticked loudly in the kitchen. The refrigerator hummed. Wind moved through the trees and brushed the walls with a constant whisper. Most of the time it was peaceful, but the third floor always bothered me. You reached it by climbing a narrow staircase that twisted sharply at the top. The air up there felt different, heavier somehow, like it didn't circulate the same way as the rest of the house. There were 3 bedrooms on that floor. One belonged to my Aunt Beth, who was much older than me and only stayed there occasionally. Even before I knew anything strange about it, her room made my skin prickle. It wasn't decorated in a scary way. It looked like any spare bedroom in an old house. But whenever I stood in the doorway, I had the strong feeling that I was intruding. The air felt close. Sounds seemed muffled, like the room was holding its breath. I would linger for a second, and then find an excuse to leave. One afternoon, Beth was upstairs complaining about noises in the walls. She said she'd been hearing scratching and dull thumping for days. The adults assumed it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a squirrel trapped somewhere between the boards. That wasn't unusual in a house that old. Still, there was an edge to her voice that made me curious. I followed her upstairs while she investigated. I remember standing in the doorway while she and another adult dragged a heavy dresser away from the wall. It scraped across the floor with a long groan that echoed through the room. Behind it was a piece of plywood nailed directly to the wall. It didn't match anything around it. The rest of the room was painted and wallpapered. But that patch was raw, unpainted wood, like a scar. The moment I saw it, my curiosity locked on. Kids have a radar for hidden things. A secret panel in a wall is basically an invitation. The adults pried the plywood loose. The nails squealed as they came out, and dust shook down in a fine cloud. Behind it was a tiny door. It was shockingly small. No more than 3 feet high and narrow enough that I couldn't imagine an adult squeezing through. It looked like something built for a child, or something that didn't need much space. The door had a simple old lock, rusted at the edges. I don't remember exactly how they got it open, only that after a few moments of rattling and muttered frustration, it clicked. The smell hit us first. It was a thick, unstale smell of dust and old wood, the kind that coats the back of your throat. Beth crouched and pulled the door open wider. Beyond it was a cramped little hallway, barely tall enough for me to stand hunched over. The adults hesitated, but I didn't. I ducked inside before anyone could stop me, driven by that fearless curiosity kids sometimes have. The air inside was colder. My shoulders brushed the walls as I shuffled forward. The beam of light from the bedroom stretched only a short distance into the hallway, fading into shadow. Every step stirred dust that sparkled in the thin light. I could hear my own breathing loud in my ears. At the end of the hallway was a tiny room. Calling it a room feels generous. It was more like a pocket carved into the walls of the house. I couldn't stand in it. I had to sit. The ceiling pressed down low enough that I instinctively hunched even more. There was almost nothing inside. Just a small chair sitting in the center of the floor. It looked like a doll's chair, the kind you'd expect to see in a child's tea set. It was delicate, with thin legs and a curved back, and it was coated in a thick layer of dust. The wallpaper in the little room had once been patterned, but it had yellowed with age until the design was barely visible. Cobwebs sagged in the corners like abandoned curtains. I remember feeling a wave of sadness and unease all at once. The space felt forgotten in a way that was hard to describe, not just unused, but sealed away, like it had been deliberately hidden. Then I saw the walls. The hallway behind me and the tiny room around me were covered in scratches, not random marks or scuffs from furniture. These were gouges cut deep into the surface, clustered in groups of 3. They ran along the walls at different heights, some near the floor, some at shoulder level, some slashing diagonally across the wallpaper. What made my stomach drop was how fresh they looked. Everything else in that space was buried in dust. The chair, the floor, the corners. But inside the gouges, the wood was clean. No dust had settled in them. They looked recent, sharp-edged, like they'd been carved yesterday. I reached out and hovered my fingers near one set without touching it. The grooves were too evenly spaced to be an accident. They looked intentional. My imagination, already primed by every horror story I'd been reading, filled in the blanks instantly. 3-fingered hands. Something trapped in the walls. Something that didn't belong in a space meant for people. A chill crawled up my back so fast, it almost made me dizzy. I backed out of the room without saying a word. The hallway felt tighter on the way out, the air thicker. When I emerged into Beth's bedroom, the normal light felt blinding. The adults were talking, but I barely heard them. My focus was still locked on the memory of those gouges. I burned into my mind. I didn't go near that room again during that visit. Even passing the doorway made my chest tighten. At night, lying in bed downstairs, I imagined scratching sounds moving through the walls, traveling from that hidden hallway down to the rest of the house. Every creak felt personal. Every thump made me hold my breath. Years passed, but the memory stuck with me in a way most childhood moments don't. It didn't blur. It stayed sharp and detailed. In high school, I convinced a few friends to come see the house. I wanted to prove to myself that it had been real, that I hadn't exaggerated it in my head. By then, the place was in worse shape. The stairs to the third floor were soft with rot, each step sagging under our weight. We made it halfway up before I lost my nerve. The wood groaned so loudly it felt like a warning. I pictured the entire staircase collapsing and dropping us through the house. We turned back. Not long after that, the house was torn down. I didn't see it happen, but I heard about it from family. The land was cleared, the structure erased. That tiny hidden hallway and the little room with the chair disappeared with it. No one ever offered a satisfying explanation for what it had been. A storage crawlspace, maybe. A strange architectural leftover from a different era. Old houses collect odd features. But none of those explanations erased the feeling of standing in that cramped pocket of space, from staring at fresh gouges in walls that should have been untouched for decades. Even now, when I think about it, I can smell the dust. I can see the thin beam of light stretching down that narrow hallway. I remember the chair sitting alone in the center of the room, like it had been placed there for a purpose I couldn't understand. The house is gone, and with it any chance of investigating further. All that's left is the memory of a hidden room inside a leaning old structure in the woods, and the uncomfortable certainty that something had been inside those walls long after everyone assumed it was empty. Sorry to pause for just a moment. If this is your first time here, welcome. I hope you're enjoying the calm so far. If you'd like more nights like this, true stories, gentle rain, no interruptions, please subscribe to Lacuna Noir. It really helps me keep creating these peaceful experiences for you. And tap the bell so you're here every time a new story arrives in the dark. Now, back to the story. I was around 6 years old when it happened, and even now I can still picture that afternoon with a clarity that feels unfair. Some childhood memories fade into soft shapes and colors, but this one never did. It stayed sharp. Our washing machine had broken that week, and my mom didn't have the money to fix it right away. So we started going to a small laundromat in a shopping center a few miles from our house. At that age, it felt like an adventure. I liked the noise of the machines, the spinning windows, the smell of detergent, and the way time felt slower when we were there. That day was warm in that heavy June way, where the air feels thick and the sun is starting to sink, but the heat still clings to everything. The sky was turning orange and pink around the edges, and the parking lot shimmered slightly from the leftover warmth of the day. My mom was inside loading clothes into a big washer, and I was sitting on the back edge of her car with a piece of candy she'd given me to keep me busy. I remember swinging my legs and watching cars come and go, feeling proud that I was old enough to sit outside by myself for a few minutes. The shopping center wasn't very big. There was the laundromat, a small grocery store, a nail salon, and a pizza place with faded posters in the window. The boulevard in front of it was wide and busy, a main road that people used to speed through to get across town. Even as a kid, I understood that the road was dangerous. My mom had warned me more than once not to step off the curb, so I stayed planted on the car, sticky candy on my fingers, watching traffic like it was a show. At first I heard the engines before I saw anything. It was a deep, angry sound that didn't match the normal flow of cars. It was louder, faster, like something tearing through the air. I remember turning my head toward the boulevard and squinting, trying to find where the noise was coming from. Then I saw them in the distance, two vehicles side by side, moving much faster than anything else on the road. One was a primer-colored hot rod, dull and unfinished looking, like it was halfway through a paint job. The other was a van, boxy and dark, keeping pace with it. Even at 6 years old, I understood they were racing. There was a strange excitement in my chest as I watched them approach. It felt unreal, like a scene from a movie playing out right in front of me. They didn't slow down as they got closer to the intersection near the shopping center. If anything, they seemed to go faster. The road rose slightly at that point, just enough to form a gentle hump. I remember thinking, in that simple way kids do, that they were going to hit it like a ramp. And they did. Both vehicles lifted at the same time. It was only for a second, maybe less, but I can still see it frozen in my mind. The hot rod and the van rose off the pavement together, their sides slamming into each other in midair with a sound that cracked through the evening. It was louder than anything I'd ever heard. The van came down hard, but kept moving forward, wobbling before straightening out. The hot rod didn't recover. It hit the ground wrong and started to roll. Everything after that felt slow and fast at the same time. The car flipped once, then again, metal screaming against asphalt. On the third roll, it bounced, almost hopping, and for a split second, the inside of the car was exposed. I saw a movement. I didn't fully understand what I was seeing, only that the driver was no longer fully inside. There was another impact, another horrible sound. And then the car slammed down and skidded to a stop in a shower of sparks. I didn't scream. I didn't move. I just stared. The world around me went strangely quiet, like someone had turned the volume down. I could hear my own breathing and the faint hum of the laundromat machines behind me. Then people started shouting. Doors opened. Someone yelled to call 911. Tires screeched as cars slammed on their brakes. And then I saw something roll. At first, my brain refused to understand it. It was just an object, tumbling across the pavement, bouncing once before dropping into the gutter near the edge of the parking lot. It came to rest only a few feet from where I was sitting, close enough that I could see it clearly. That was the moment the shock hit me. My stomach dropped so hard it felt like I was falling. I didn't have the words for what I was looking at, not at 6 years old. I just knew it was wrong, terribly wrong. My hands started shaking, and the candy slipped from my fingers onto the pavement. I remember sliding off the car slowly, my legs weak. I didn't want to look anymore, but I couldn't stop. The air smelled like burned rubber and something sharp and metallic. Adults were running past me toward the wreck, their voices loud and panicked. A woman grabbed my shoulders and turned me away, pulling me against her chest so I couldn't see. I didn't know her. I just stood there frozen while she held me, her heart pounding as hard as mine. My mom came running out of the laundromat a second later. I'll never forget the look on her face when she saw the scene, then saw me standing there. She rushed over and pulled me away from the curb, asking over and over if I was okay. I couldn't answer. My throat felt locked shut. All I could do was nod, my eyes still trying to drift back toward the gutter even though I didn't want them to. Sirens filled the air soon after. Police cars, an ambulance, flashing lights reflecting off the store windows. The shopping center turned into chaos. People were crying, talking loudly, pointing. Someone covered the wreck with a tarp. Another person led me and my mom inside the laundromat to get us away from the scene. Inside, everything felt normal in a way that made it worse. The machines kept spinning. A dryer buzzed. A little kid laughed somewhere near the front. I sat in a plastic chair while my mom knelt in front of me, holding my hands and asking what I saw. I tried to explain, but the words came out broken and confused. She hugged me so tight I could barely breathe, and I clung to her like I was afraid she might disappear too. We didn't finish the laundry that night. She left everything in the machines and took me straight home. I remember sitting in the back seat, staring out the window, half expecting the whole world to look different. But it didn't. People were still walking their dogs. A couple argued on a sidewalk. A man carried groceries into his house. Life kept moving like nothing had happened. That was the part that scared me the most. For weeks after, I had trouble sleeping. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the cars lifting off the road. I heard the crash. I saw that object rolling again and again. I started refusing to sit near windows. Loud noises made me jump. My mom tried to reassure me, telling me accidents were rare, that I was safe, that I didn't need to be afraid. But fear doesn't listen to logic, especially when you're a kid. Even now, years later, I can still feel the heat of that June evening and taste the sugar from the candy I was eating. I can still hear the roar of the engines echoing down the boulevard. It's strange how a single moment can carve itself into your memory so deeply that time can't dull it. I've driven past that shopping center as an adult. It looks smaller than I remember. The laundromat is gone, replaced by a discount store. The road has new paint, new signs, but the rise in the intersection is still there. Every time I pass it, I slow down without meaning to. My chest tightens, and for a second I'm 6 years old again, sitting on the back of a car, watching something I was never meant to see. Some memories don't fade. They just settle quietly inside you, waiting for the smallest trigger to wake them up. And when they do, they come back just as vivid as the day they happen. I was 7 years old, standing in front of our house with my dad on a mild spring afternoon. It was one of those days where nothing special is supposed to happen. The air smelled like fresh grass, the sky was clear, and the neighborhood felt quiet in that comfortable way, where you can hear distant lawnmowers and birds, but not much else. My dad and I were just standing there to pass time. I don't even remember what we were talking about. It was casual, meaningless conversation. The kind adults have with kids when they're relaxed and not in a hurry. We were facing the house across the street, watching nothing in particular. The neighbor's yard looked the same as always. Their gutters ran down the side of the house into a metal storm drain that stuck out near the ground. I had seen it 1,000 times and never given it a second thought. At that age, my world was small and familiar. Every crack in the sidewalk and every tree on the block felt permanent. Then the birds showed up. At first, it was just a few crows circling overhead. I noticed them because of the sound. Crows don't sing like smaller birds. They announce themselves. Their calls were loud and rough, echoing down the street. 3 of them swooped low over the neighbor's roof, circling in a tight loop. My dad paused mid-sentence and looked up with me. We both followed their movement, curious but not worried. One of the crows suddenly dove down toward the yard. It landed near the base of the storm drain and started pecking at it aggressively. The other 2 crows joined it almost immediately. They weren't just exploring. They were tearing at something with purpose. Metal clanged as their beaks hammered against the drain opening. It took me a few seconds to understand what they were after. Small, frantic chirping exploded from inside the drain. A pair of finches shot out from the opening like tiny brown bullets. They circled wildly, squeaking in panic. I remember pointing and saying something like, "Birds," because that was the only word my brain could produce. The finches darted back and forth, trying to distract the crows, but the crows didn't care. They forced their heads into the drain opening and kept ripping at whatever was inside. A nest. Even at 7, I understood that much. The finches had built their home inside the drain, tucked away where it felt safe. The crows had found it. The chirping turned into a desperate noise that I can still hear in my memory. It wasn't loud, but it was sharp and helpless. The crows tore the nest apart piece by piece. Bits of straw and fluff drifted onto the lawn. One crow pulled something pale and small from inside and tossed its head back to swallow. I didn't fully understand what I was seeing, but I knew it was wrong in a deep, instinctive way. Then it got worse. One of the finches made a mistake and flew too close. A crow snapped at it midair and caught it. There was a blur of black wings and frantic flapping. The crow pinned the tiny bird to the grass. What happened next took seconds, but it stretched into something endless in my mind. The crow jerked its head sharply, and the finch stopped moving. The motion was so quick, so efficient, it didn't look real. It looked like a trick, like a toy being snapped apart. I stood frozen. I had never seen violence outside of a screen before. Animals in cartoons popped back up after being crushed. Movie monsters weren't real. But this was happening right across the street in bright daylight, and there was no music or warning or distance to soften it, just feathers scattered on green grass. The surviving finch fled. It vanished into the trees, and for a moment everything went still, except for the crows picking through the remains of the nest. I remember looking up at my dad. His face was tight in a way I didn't recognize. He wasn't smiling anymore. He wasn't talking. He was just watching. I thought it was over. 3 minutes later, the air changed. It started as a faint buzzing sound like wind moving through leaves. Then the noise grew louder and sharper. I looked up and saw a cloud of movement rushing down the street. At first, I couldn't make sense of it. It looked like a piece of the sky had broken loose. Then the shapes separated into birds, dozens of finches. They came from everywhere at once, pouring out of the trees and power lines, a swirling storm of tiny bodies. The single surviving finch had returned with reinforcements. They descended on the yard in a screaming wave. The sound was unbelievable, high-pitched, furious chirping layered so thick it felt like pressure in my ears. The crows tried to fight back. They snapped and lunged, catching a few of the smaller birds. Feathers burst into the air like thrown dust. But the finches didn't scatter. They swarmed. They covered the crows in a living cloud, pecking and battering them from all sides. The crows' sleek black shapes disappeared under the mass of fluttering wings. I remember grabbing my dad's hand without realizing I'd moved. My stomach felt cold. This wasn't nature as I'd imagined it from picture books. This was war. Tiny bodies slammed into larger ones with desperate force. The air was filled with frantic motion and noise and falling feathers. One crow stumbled, dragged down by the weight of birds clinging to it. It hit the ground and didn't get back up. The swarm piled on. The second crow tried to escape, beating its wings hard enough to lift off, but the finches chased it relentlessly. It rose a few feet, dipped, and crashed back into the yard where the same storm swallowed it. The third crow managed to break away. It flew crookedly toward a small hill nearby, its flight uneven. Even I could see something was wrong with its wing. It made it halfway up the slope before collapsing into the grass. The finches didn't follow. They circled once, twice, then scattered back into the trees as suddenly as they had come. Silence dropped over the street. Feathers drifted slowly to the ground. The yard looked torn apart, littered with bits of nest and dark shapes that didn't move. My ears rang from the sudden absence of sound. I realized I had been holding my breath and let it out in a shaky rush. I had seen the movie The Birds not long before that day. It had scared me in the fun, distant way horror movies scare kids. But this was different. This was real, messy, and final. There was no hero stepping in to fix it. No explanation. Just a brutal exchange that ended as quickly as it began. I looked up at my dad again, searching his face for some adult reaction that would tell me how to feel. He stared at the yard, eyes wide, like he was trying to process what we'd both witnessed. Then he said, very quietly, but very clearly, "What the fuck?" It was the first time I had ever heard him swear. The words hung in the air heavier than the feathers. Part of me was shocked by the language, but a bigger part understood that he didn't have any other words. Neither of us did. We stood there for a long time without speaking. The neighborhood slowly returned to its normal sounds. A car passed. A dog barked in the distance. The world kept going like nothing had happened. But something had shifted for me. Until that afternoon, animals had belonged to a gentle category in my mind. They were pets, cartoons, storybook creatures. Seeing that sudden explosion of violence cracked that illusion wide open. I learned, in a way no one had to explain, that nature isn't soft or fair. It's raw and immediate. Life protects itself with everything it has. For weeks afterward, I kept replaying the scene in my head. The dive of the crow, the desperate return of the finch army, the impossible noise of 50 tiny birds acting as one furious force. I would look at birds differently after that. Every sparrow on a fence wire seemed capable of hidden intensity. Every crow's shadow felt heavier. Even now, years later, I can picture that spring afternoon perfectly. The color of the grass, the angle of the sun, the swirl of feathers in the air. It wasn't just a childhood memory. It was the first time I saw the world behave in a way adults usually try to shield kids from. Sudden, violent, and completely indifferent to who was watching. And what stays with me just as strongly as the birds is my dad's voice beside me. That stunned, honest reaction. No lesson, no comforting explanation. Just shared disbelief between a father and a child standing on a quiet street, realizing at the same time how wild the world could be. I had a beautiful cat named Oreo, and she had been a part of my life for 15 years. She wasn't just a pet, she was a companion, a constant presence in the small moments of my life, and the one creature who seemed to understand me without words. In early 2011, we had to make the heartbreaking decision to put her down. She had developed terminal cancer of the jaw, and her suffering was undeniable. I wasn't there for her final moments. I was away in Anaheim at an internship. I buried in work and trying to build a future. While the cat, who had been with me through so many years, slipped away without my presence. Coming back home after the program, I felt hollow, drained, and more alone than I had ever felt in my life. The grief of losing Oreo, compounded by my absence during her last days, weighed heavily on me. 2 days after moving back into our tiny condo, I was lying in bed late at night. I had a movie on the TV, I trying to distract myself from the heaviness pressing down on me. The apartment was silent, aside from the faint hum of the air conditioning. Suddenly, a sound cut through the quiet. A meow, soft and questioning, just like Oreo used to make when she wanted attention. My body reacted immediately. I sat up, my heart racing, thinking maybe she had gotten outside or we had a stray in the apartment. I moved toward the kitchen to check the food and water bowls, even reaching for a treat. Then it hit me. I froze. I didn't own any cats. The condo was mine alone. completely empty except for myself. There was no way for a cat to be there. And yet, I had heard that distinct, familiar meow. It was Oreo. That sound, the way she would ask for attention, tilting her head slightly, mewing softly, was unmistakable. My mind raced. Was I hearing things? Was my grief twisting my senses, making me imagine her voice? I tried to rationalize it. Maybe a neighbor's cat had somehow wandered in. But the windows were closed, the doors were locked, and there was no sign of anyone else in the building. I stood in the dark for a moment, completely still, listening for it again, hoping that maybe I could confirm what I had just heard. My ears strained in the silence of the condo. The hum of the electronics and the quiet tick of the air conditioning suddenly amplified in my awareness. But nothing followed. No scratching, no patting of little paws, no repeated meow, just silence. The more I thought about it, the colder the room felt. Not physically, but emotionally, as if a presence I couldn't see had filled the space around me. My chest tightened, and my mind raced through every logical explanation I could muster. Could grief do this? Could memory and longing summon such a real, unmistakable sound? I had loved Oreo for 15 years. I had known every sound she made, every soft purr, every demanding meow, every gentle nudge. And this was no memory or imagination. It sounded alive, immediate, present. I couldn't move for several minutes, just standing there, hoping against hope for it to come again. I imagined the tiny head of Oreo poking around the corner, or the familiar brush of her fur against my legs. I thought about all the times I had missed with her, all the moments I would never have again, and a wave of grief washed over me, stronger than before. But it wasn't just sadness. There was something else, a warmth, a presence, something that felt like her reaching out, even beyond the veil of life. After a long moment, I finally sat back on the bed, shaken and trying to make sense of what had happened. Rationally. I wanted to tell myself it was my mind, that the grief and exhaustion had made me hallucinate a familiar sound. Yet deep down, in the quiet, still part of me that didn't want to be rational. I knew what I had heard. It was her. Oreo. Somehow, she had found a way to reach me. Even years later, I think about that night. I think about the quiet meow, so simple, yet so full of presence. I think about the loneliness I had felt, the grief I had carried, and the way that small, impossible moment reminded me that love and connection don't always end with death. Oreo was gone, but for that instant, she was there. Not as a memory, not as an echo, but as a living presence in the room with me. And in that moment, the condo, so quiet and small, felt a little less empty. I grew up in the South in the late 70s and early 80s. The kind of place where summers felt endless and the air itself seemed heavy with heat. My grandmother lived on a cotton farm in South Carolina, miles away from anything that could be called a town. Visiting her was the highlight of every summer. My cousin and I would get shipped out there as soon as school ended, and for weeks our world was just dirt roads, open fields, and the slow rhythm of farm life. The farm sat in a wide stretch of land surrounded by woods. In the mornings, we'd help with chores, nothing too serious, just enough to make us feel important. We'd feed animals, carry tools, sweep out the shed. But by early afternoon, the heat would settle in like a blanket you couldn't kick off. Even the adults slowed down. That was our cue to disappear. A river ran not too far from the property, hidden behind a line of trees and reachable by a worn path we knew by heart. That river was our refuge. The water was cool and dark, and the bank was soft with mud and tall grass. It felt like a secret place, even though it wasn't really. Our favorite swimming spot was isolated, tucked away from the main crossing where people sometimes fished. The only sign of civilization nearby was an old dirt road that split off from the gravel highway and ran deep into the woods toward an abandoned farmhouse no one used anymore. We'd heard stories about that house. Every kid in the area had. Depending on who was telling it, the place was haunted, cursed, or home to some reclusive family that didn't like strangers. Adults would laugh it off, but they never went near it either. That alone was enough to keep the stories alive in our minds. One afternoon after lunch, we headed down to the river like always. The cicadas were screaming in the trees, and the air shimmered above the road. We slipped into the water and floated on our backs, I letting the current tug at us gently. Time felt slow there. The world outside the woods might as well not have existed. I don't know how long we'd been in the water when I noticed the dust. At first, it was just a faint cloud rising in the distance beyond the trees. The kind you see when a vehicle kicks up dirt on a dry road. I nudged my cousin and pointed. We both squinted toward it. Our first thought was that it might be our uncle coming to drag us back early. But he never drove the tractor down to the river, and he never came before we'd had our full hour. Then the old stories crept in. We'd heard whispers about trouble in the area a few summers before. Some kids getting chased off by a strange family, living deep in the woods. The adults always cut the story short when we asked for details, which only made it worse in our imaginations. Standing there waist-deep in the river, watching that dust cloud get closer, I felt a cold knot form in my stomach despite the heat. We slipped quietly out of the water and crouched low along the riverbank, using the brush for cover. From there, we could see the dirt road clearly without being seen ourselves. The sound came next, the low, uneven rumble of an engine that didn't sound like farm equipment. A car rolled into view. It was an old Oldsmobile Delta 88, dull and faded, the kind of car that already looked abandoned even while it was moving. The windows were blacked out so dark you couldn't see inside. It crept along the dirt road at a slow, deliberate pace. There was something about the way it moved that made my skin crawl. It wasn't speeding. It wasn't lost. It looked like it knew exactly where it was going. As it passed our hiding spot, I noticed something else. There was no license plate. We didn't say a word. We just watched. The car continued another 30 yards or so before stopping. The engine idled. For a second, nothing happened. Then the passenger window slid down halfway and a black garbage bag came flying out. It landed in the cotton field with a soft thud, disappearing slightly into the plants. The bag wasn't big, about the size of a football, but it landed heavy. The window rolled back up. The driver took their time making a careful three-point turn, steering with exaggerated caution so the tires wouldn't crush too much of the cotton. It was such a strange detail that it stuck with me. Whoever was inside cared about not damaging the field. That calm, methodical movement was more unsettling than if they'd sped off in panic. When the car finally turned around, it headed back the way it came, disappearing into the trees. The sound of the engine faded until the woods swallowed it completely. Silence rushed in after it. My cousin and I looked at each other. Neither of us had to say what we were thinking. The bag sat there in the field, black against the pale green cotton. Every instinct told me we should run back to the farm, tell an adult, forget we ever saw it. But we were 13. Fear and curiosity mix in a dangerous way at that age. The unknown pulls harder than common sense. We stepped out from hiding and moved toward the road, glancing back over our shoulders every few seconds. The world felt different now, sharper. Every rustle in the trees made my heart jump. The bag didn't look any less suspicious up close. If anything, it looked worse. When we reached the edge of the field, I saw the blood. It was smeared faintly on the cotton plants above where the bag had landed. Dark, sticky patches that hadn't dried yet. My cousin froze beside me. I remember the sound of my own breathing, loud in my ears. We should have stopped right there. Instead, we stepped into the field. The cotton brushed against our legs as we pushed forward. The bag sat half hidden between the rows. I could smell something metallic in the air. My hands were shaking when I crouched down. For a moment, neither of us touched it. We just stared. "Open it," my cousin whispered. I don't know why I listened. I pulled the bag open slowly. The plastic stuck to itself, peeling apart with a soft, horrible sound. Inside, wrapped in a bloody washcloth, was a tiny baby girl. She was so small that for a split second my brain refused to understand what I was looking at. She looked like she was sleeping. Her face was peaceful, her skin pale and streaked with dried blood. She wasn't moving. The cloth around her was soaked through, the world tilted. I remember a buzzing in my head, like all the sound had drained out of the air. My cousin made a choking noise beside me. I couldn't look away. That image burned itself into me in a way nothing ever had before. She was a person, a life, and someone had thrown her away like trash. We stumbled back from the bag at the same time. I don't remember deciding to run, but suddenly we were running. Branches whipped at our arms as we tore through the woods toward the farm. My chest hurt, my vision blurred, but we didn't slow down. When we burst into the yard, the adults knew immediately something was wrong. We were crying too hard to speak at first. It took several tries to explain what we'd seen. I'll never forget my grandmother's face as the words finally came out. The color drained from her cheeks. Everything after that moved fast. Calls were made. Neighbors arrived. Police cars came screaming down the gravel road, lights flashing in the hot afternoon sun. We had to lead them back to the river, back to the dirt road, back to the field. I couldn't bring myself to look at the bag again. I stared at the ground while the officers worked. They told us later that we'd done the right thing by coming forward. I never felt like we had. I felt like we'd crossed into something we were never meant to see. That image followed me home at the end of summer. It followed me into adulthood. Even now, decades later, I can close my eyes and see that tiny bundle in the black plastic bag, lying alone in the cotton field. I've lived a full life since then. I've seen accidents, funerals, heartbreak, but nothing ever hit me with the same cold shock as that afternoon. Sometimes I think about how quiet the woods were after the car left, how normal everything looked. The river still flowed. The insects still sang. The sun still burned overhead. The world didn't pause. It never does. But for me, a piece of that summer is frozen in time. 2 kids standing in a field, staring into a bag that held something no child should ever have to understand. And no matter how many years pass, that moment still feels close enough to touch. My wife and I moved into our new house in July, and at the time it felt like the start of a clean chapter. The place was brand new, still smelling faintly of fresh paint and cut wood. Everything looked perfect in that staged, untouched way new houses do, like a model home that no one had fully lived in yet. We were excited, proud, and honestly a little nervous about finally owning a place of our own. Every small sound the house made felt magnified because it was unfamiliar. New houses settle, People told us. They creak, they pop, they sigh at night as the temperature changes. We repeated that to ourselves a lot during those first weeks, even knowing that the house had a strange personality after dark. During the day, it felt bright and open. Sunlight filled every corner, and the street outside was full of normal suburban noise. At night, it was different. The neighborhood went quiet in a way that made every tiny sound inside seem louder. You could hear the structure adjusting, nigh little knocks from the wall, soft groans from the floorboards. None of it was dramatic, just enough to remind you that the house was alive in its own mechanical way. One weekend, a buddy of mine named Rodney came over to hang out. We hadn't seen each other in a while, and it turned into one of those nights where time slips away without you noticing. We grilled in the backyard, drank more than we planned to, and stayed up talking about old memories and dumb stories from our 20s. My wife laughed at us most of the night, shaking her head at how easily we fell back into the same rhythm we had years ago. It was a good night, simple and warm, the kind of evening that makes you feel settled in your life. By the time we finally decided to call it a night, it was late, and we were all tired in that heavy, pleasant way that follows a few drinks. We had set Rodney up in the guest room down the hall. The house was quiet except for the hum of the air conditioning and the occasional tick from the kitchen as the temperature dropped. My wife and I were already half asleep when we heard a knock on our bedroom door. It wasn't loud or urgent. It was playful. A quick, exaggerated knock, like someone trying to be funny. I opened one eye and groaned. Before I could even sit up, Rodney called through the door in a joking voice, asking if he could sleep in our bed because there was a ghost in his room. Oh, he dragged the word ghost out in a mock, spooky tone, clearly trying to mess with us. I laughed and told him to go to bed. He laughed too, and I heard his footsteps retreat down the hall. We didn't think anything of it. It was exactly the kind of dumb joke he would make after a few drinks. My wife rolled over and muttered something about grown men acting like kids, and we both drifted back to sleep. The rest of the night passed without incident. At least that's what I thought. The next day was lazy and slow. Rodney left late in the morning after coffee and leftovers from the night before. He seemed normal, maybe a little hungover, but nothing unusual. We joked again about the ghost, and he laughed it off, saying the guest room just felt creepy in a new house kind of way. I didn't press him about it. New places always feel strange at first. That was the explanation we stuck with. It wasn't until later that afternoon that things got weird. Rodney called me, and right away I could hear something off in his voice. He sounded unsettled, like he was trying to laugh something off but couldn't quite manage it. He told me his girlfriend had asked him a strange question that morning. She wanted to know why he had called her in the middle of the night. He told her he hadn't called her at all. He had been at my place, asleep in the guest room. She insisted he had. She said she had a missed call from him and a voicemail. Rodney checked his phone while we were talking. There was no outgoing call on his end, no record of it. Nothing in his call history that matched what she was saying. He told me he figured it was a glitch. Phones do weird things sometimes. But then she played the voicemail for him. He was quiet for a second while he told me this part. I could hear him breathing through the phone, like just remembering it was enough to bring the feeling back. The voicemail wasn't his voice. It wasn't anyone's voice in a normal sense. It was a loud, droning sound layered with interference, like a broken radio signal mixed with a deep, distorted growl. He said it made the hair on his arms stand up just listening to it. Over that noise, her phone's automatic transcription system tried to interpret what it was hearing. The text it produced read, "Help me. Help me. Are you there? Help me, please." When he told me that, I felt a cold ripple go through my chest. I actually laughed at first, a nervous reflex. I told him it had to be some kind of glitch, some scrambled signal that the phone misread. He agreed, but neither of us sounded convinced. The words were too specific, too desperate. It wasn't random text. It read like a message. He sent me a screenshot of the transcription and a copy of the audio file. I stood in my kitchen staring at my phone for a long time before I hit play. Part of me didn't want to hear it. It felt stupid to be scared of a voicemail. But there was a weight to the situation that I couldn't explain. When I finally listened, the sound was worse than I expected. It wasn't just static. It was layered, thick, almost organic. There was a rhythm to it, like breathing buried under distortion. I couldn't pick out actual words in the audio, but knowing what the transcription said made my brain try to force meaning into the noise. The longer I listened, the more it felt like something was trying to push through the interference. I shut it off halfway through. The house was quiet around me, the same quiet it always had during the day, but it suddenly felt heavier. Every creak in the walls made me look up. Every shadow seemed darker. I told myself I was being ridiculous. It was a phone glitch, a coincidence, a drunk guy making a joke and a bad connection, creating a creepy voicemail. There were 100 logical explanations, but the timing bothered me. The knock on the door, the joke about the ghost, the call in the middle of the night from inside my house. Even if it was all random, the pieces lined up in a way that felt wrong. That night, when my wife and I went to bed, I couldn't shake the memory of that sound. The house made its usual settling noises, but now every pop in the walls felt intentional, like footsteps muffled by distance. I stared at the ceiling for a long time, listening. At one point, I almost got up to check the guest room, just to prove to myself that it was empty and ordinary. I didn't go. I stayed in bed and told myself that feeding the fear would only make it worse. Nothing else happened. No voices, no knocks, just the slow breathing of the house and the city beyond it. Eventually, I fell asleep. Life moved on the way it always does. Bills, work, errands, normal days stacking on top of each other. Rodney never got another voicemail like that. His girlfriend never received another strange call. On the surface, the incident faded into a weird story we told once or twice at parties, always followed by nervous laughter. But sometimes, late at night, when the house creaks just right, I think about that message. I think about a call that never existed on one phone, but appeared on another. I think about a voice that wasn't a voice asking for help through a wall of static. And I remember Rodney standing in our hallway, joking about a ghost in his room, hours before that message arrived. I still tell myself it was a glitch. That's the version of the story that lets me sleep comfortably in a house that is supposed to be safe. Still, every once in a while, when the night is very quiet and the air feels thick, I wonder what would have happened if we had answered, and whether something tried to reach out from inside those brand new walls on the first summer we lived there. It still makes my skin crawl when I replay that night in my head. Even now, years later, I can remember every detail with uncomfortable clarity. It was a Saturday night, quiet and ordinary in every possible way. My wife was out of town visiting family, so I had the house to myself. Normally, I enjoy that kind of solitude. I made a simple dinner, nothing special, and was standing at the sink, rinsing dishes, already thinking about what movie I might watch before bed. The house felt peaceful. I wrapped in that heavy nighttime silence that only comes when you're truly alone. The only light in the kitchen came from above the stove and the small bulb over the sink. Outside the window was nothing but darkness. Our backyard doesn't have streetlights behind it, so once the sun goes down, it turns into a solid wall of black. I'd gotten used to that. I never really thought about what might be out there because there was never any reason to. While I was scrubbing a plate, something flickered past the window in my peripheral vision. It was just a hint of movement, the kind your brain almost dismisses before you consciously register it. But it startled me enough that I froze with my hands still in the sink. I slowly turned my head and stared out into the yard. At first, I couldn't see anything. The glass was dirty with water spots and streaks, and the darkness beyond it was thick. I leaned closer, trying to let my eyes adjust, scanning left to right. Nothing. I stood there for a full minute, listening. The house was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Outside, there were no footsteps, no rustling, no sign that anything had actually been there. I told myself it was probably a bird or a large insect flying close to the window. When you're alone at night, your brain fills in gaps with worst-case scenarios. I shook it off and went back to the dishes, trying to laugh at how jumpy I'd become. Maybe a minute passed before the motion sensor floodlight over the back patio snapped on. The sudden white light filled the kitchen, sharp and intrusive. My stomach dropped instantly. That light doesn't trigger easily. It's calibrated so that small animals don't set it off. A bird wouldn't do it. A stray cat usually wouldn't either. Something bigger had walked in front of it. I didn't think. My hand just moved. I grabbed the largest knife sitting in the drying rack and held it tight enough that my knuckles hurt. Every sound in the house seemed to disappear. I could see the glow of the floodlight bleeding around the edges of the patio curtains. Something was out there, and it was close enough to the house to trip the sensor. I moved slowly toward the back door, placing each step carefully so the floor wouldn't creak. My breathing felt too loud. My heart was pounding so hard it echoed in my ears. I remember standing there, inches from the curtain, debating what to do. Part of me wanted to rip the curtain open and confront whatever it was. The other part wanted to peek through a tiny slit and gather information first. Instinct won. I pinched the fabric and eased it open just enough to see. At first, I saw nothing unusual. The patio was empty. The light cast hard shadows across the yard, turning everything into sharp shapes. Then I noticed something at the edge of the light. Just beyond its reach was a grayish curve that didn't belong. It was low to the ground and moving slightly. Not walking, not shifting position, rocking. The movement was slow and steady, like something crouched and swaying. My brain scrambled to label it. A trash bag, a lawn ornament, an animal. None of the explanations fit what I was seeing. It didn't match any shape I recognized. The longer I stared, the more wrong it felt. Then it stood up. What I'd been looking at wasn't an object. It was the back of something that had been squatting. As it rose, it unfolded into a height that made my chest tighten. It was tall, shockingly tall. Even from a distance, I could tell it was at least as tall as I am, and I'm 6'4". My grip tightened on the knife. Every muscle in my body locked. My first thought was that someone was in my yard and I was about to have to defend my home. It hadn't seen me yet. Its back was still turned. For a split second, I considered opening the door and yelling, trying to scare it off. Before I could move, it slowly turned its head. The moment I saw its face stretched into something unreal. Time didn't feel normal. My brain recorded every detail in a flash that felt like it lasted forever. Its face was smooth and pale, almost featureless, like a mask with no emotion. The eyes were the worst part. They were enormous, dark with a reddish tint. far too large for its head. They dominated the face in a way that didn't look natural, didn't look human. A sound came out of me that I'm not proud of. I stumbled backward from the door, my heart slamming against my ribs so hard I thought I might actually pass out. My hands were shaking so badly the knife trembled. I couldn't process what I'd just seen. Every rational explanation collapsed at once. As I backed away, I saw its shadow stretch across the curtains. It had moved right up to the door. The silhouette was unmistakable. Tall, thin, slightly hunched, still rocking gently back and forth. That rocking motion was somehow more disturbing than anything else. It felt patient, intentional, like it was aware of me and in no hurry at all. My heart was beating so violently that my vision pulsed with it. I remember thinking, in a detached way, that this must be what a heart attack feels like. Fear stripped everything down to instinct. I clutched the knife and shouted. I don't remember the exact words, only that I was threatening and cursing, trying to sound bigger than I felt. The sound of my own voice shook. Then the floodlight snapped off. The darkness slammed back into place so suddenly it stole my breath. For a second, I thought the power had gone out. I stood there frozen, staring at the curtain where the shadow had been. The house was silent. I could hear my pulse in my ears. 10 seconds stretched into eternity. The light clicked back on. I flinched like I'd been hit. I looked at the curtain immediately. The shadow was gone. Whatever had been standing there had moved. I didn't feel relief. I felt worse. Now it could be anywhere in the yard, hidden in the dark beyond the light. I crept forward again, every nerve screaming at me not to. I peeked through the curtain, expecting it to be right there, inches from the glass. The patio was empty. The yard looked normal. The light illuminated grass, fence, and nothing else. Beyond that circle of brightness was pure darkness. I stared until my eyes watered, searching for any hint of movement. Nothing moved. I stood there for minutes, barely breathing, until the timer shut the floodlight off again, and the yard vanished into black. I stayed in the kitchen holding that knife long after the light died, listening for footsteps, scratching, any sign that something was trying to get in. The silence was complete. Eventually, I forced myself to act. Standing there forever wasn't an option. I grabbed a flashlight from the drawer and opened the back door just enough to slip outside. The night air felt thick and cold against my skin. I swept the beam across the yard in quick, jerky motions. The light caught the fence, the grass, the empty patio. There was nowhere obvious for something that tall to hide. I lasted maybe 5 seconds before panic overrode courage. I rushed back inside, slammed the door, and locked it. I checked every lock in the house twice. I left lights on in every room. Sleep didn't come easily that night. Every small sound snapped me awake. I never found footprints. Nothing was damaged. No sign remained that anything had been there at all. If I told the story out loud, it sounded impossible even to me. The logical part of my brain tried to rebuild reality. Stress, shadows, a trick of the light, a trespasser I misinterpreted in fear. But none of those explanations matched what I saw when that face turned toward me. I don't like dwelling on it. Thinking too long about those eyes brings back the same cold weight in my chest. I don't know what stood in my backyard that night. I don't know if it was something explainable, that my mind twisted into a nightmare, or something I simply don't have words for. All I know is that the memory is as sharp as the knife I held in my hand. And I hope I never see that rocking silhouette outside my door again. Especially not in the dark, when the house is quiet and I'm the only one home. When I was in high school, my family moved into a house that looked perfect on paper. It was modern, open, and bright, with tile floors that stayed cool even in summer and big windows that let in so much sunlight it almost felt like we were living outside. My parents loved it immediately. My sisters and I were less impressed, mostly because we realized within the first week that the layout made it impossible to sneak anywhere without being heard. My mom's bedroom sat right by the front door like a guard post. Anyone trying to leave would have to pass within 10 feet of her. The sliding glass doors in the back screamed every time they opened, a shrill scrape that echoed through the house no matter how gently you tried to move them. And the door into the garage was even worse. It didn't matter if you turned the handle slowly, if you eased it open millimeter by millimeter, or if you prayed to every god you could think of. That door announced itself. It was loud, sharp, and final. On top of that, the entire house was tile. Every step traveled. And I've always walked heavy, like my feet don't understand the concept of subtlety. My family joked they could track me by sound alone. So we adapted. We learned the house's noises the way sailors learn the creaks of a ship. We knew which floor tiles clicked, which doors needed an extra push, which corners trapped echoes. It became background information. I'm part of daily life. That's why what happened one night stuck with me so deeply. And it wasn't just a weird noise, it was a noise that didn't fit the map we had built in our heads. It was a school night. I remember that clearly because I was stressed about an exam the next morning. I was lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, drifting in that in-between state where your thoughts start to blur. The house was quiet in that late-night way where even the air feels asleep. Then I heard it, me bare feet slapping tile at a full run. It started at the garage door. I knew the exact location from the sound alone. Fast, frantic footsteps tore across the tile, down the open living space, straight toward the hallway where our bedrooms were. Then they stopped. For half a second, there was silence. Then the footsteps ran back the other direction, just as fast, just as loud, and ended at the garage door again. I didn't hear the door open. I didn't hear it close. Just the running. My eyes snapped open. Every muscle in my body locked. I didn't even sit up. I just lay there, heart hammering so hard, I could feel it in my throat, listening for any follow-up noise. The silence after was worse than the running. It pressed against my ears. My first thought was simple and stupid. Someone is in the house. Then my brain scrambled to make it normal. Maybe it was my little sister. But she never ran at night. She was the kind of kid who shuffled half asleep to the bathroom and back. And even if it was her, I would have heard a door. Every door in that house had a signature. The garage door especially. There was no way to open it quietly. I lay there frozen, staring into the darkness, convinced that if I moved, I would somehow alert whatever had made that sound. The image in my head was a stranger standing just outside my doorway, listening the way I was listening, waiting. Minutes stretched. My room felt smaller. I counted my breaths to keep from panicking. After what felt like forever, I glanced at my clock. 12:30 a.m. The glowing numbers looked unreal, like they belonged to a different world, where people weren't trapped in their beds listening to phantom footsteps. I don't know where the courage came from, but eventually fear turned into this shaky, desperate need to do something. I slid out of bed as quietly as I could. The tile was cold under my feet. Every step I took sounded explosive in my ears. I reached for the nearest object on my nightstand and wrapped my fingers around it. A hairbrush. Even in that moment, some tiny rational part of me knew how ridiculous it was, but it was solid and heavy and it was something. I held it like a weapon and crept toward my door. My older sister's room was right next to mine at the end of the hallway. The plan formed instantly. Get to her. Two people were safer than one. To reach my mom's room, I'd have to cross the open living space. And if someone was out there, I'd be completely exposed. My sister's door was 3 steps away. That was my best chance. I yanked my door open and rushed the short distance, slamming into her door with the intention of barging in dramatically, like in a movie. It didn't move. Locked. I stumbled back, startled by the resistance, and hissed her name. She opened the door a crack, face pale and eyes wide in the dim light. "Why were you running?" I whispered. She stared at me. "I thought that was you." The fear that shot through me at those words was instant and electric. We stood there looking at each other, both breathing too fast. She pulled the door open wider, and I stepped inside. Her room felt safer just because I wasn't alone anymore. We whispered back and forth, trying to make sense of it. Maybe someone had broken in. Maybe a neighbor had come inside by mistake. Every explanation sounded thin. Finally, she convinced me we had to wake our mom. That meant crossing the open space. We stepped into the hallway together. The house was dead silent. The air felt heavy, like it was holding its breath. We moved slowly, hairbrush still clutched in my hand, scanning the shadows, even though there was nowhere to hide. The open layout that made sneaking out impossible now made the house feel exposed and vulnerable. We reached my mom's room. I pushed the door open and found her and my little sister completely asleep. Deep, unmoving sleep. The sight was so normal, it almost hurt. I shook my mom awake, words tumbling over each other as I tried to explain. To her credit, she didn't brush it off. She got up immediately, checked the doors, checked the garage, checked every corner of the house. Nothing was open. Nothing was disturbed. Still, she called the police. She said there had been trouble with teenagers in the area, and maybe someone had tried to mess with us. Waiting for the cops felt endless. We all stood in the living room, lights blazing now, the house stripped of its shadows. It looked ordinary again, harmless. When the officer arrived, he did a quick sweep and found nothing. No signs of forced entry, no footprints, no reason for the sound we'd heard. We stepped outside onto the front patio to talk to him, while he filled out whatever report he needed. The front door was left open behind us, spilling light onto the driveway. I remember thinking how vulnerable that open doorway looked, like a mouth. We were mid-conversation when the doorbell rang. It was loud and sharp in the night air. All of us turned at the same time. The officer frowned and glanced at the open door. The bell rang again, then again. Rapid, impatient presses. Ding, 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 ding. It stopped. Silence. Then another burst, frantic and uneven, like someone slamming their finger into the button. It paused once more. One final ring. None of us had moved. We were standing outside. The door was open. There was no one inside to press it. I felt my stomach drop in a way I've never felt before, or since. It wasn't just fear. It was the sensation of reality slipping sideways. The officer slowly turned his head toward us. His expression had changed. The casual professionalism was gone. "I don't deal with paranormal shit," he said. At first I thought he was joking. The line was too blunt, too absurd, but he wasn't smiling. He was already backing toward his car. Within seconds, he was inside it, engine running. He gave a short, awkward nod and drove off, leaving us standing there in stunned silence. We didn't go back inside right away. None of us wanted to be the first to cross that threshold. When we finally did, the house felt wrong. The air felt thick and stale. Every shadow looked deeper than it should. That wasn't the only incident. There were other nights with footsteps, with doors clicking softly, as if tested by invisible hands. with the unmistakable feeling of being watched from the hallway. My sister swore she saw a figure standing in the living room once, darker than the dark around it. My mom heard whispering when she was alone in the kitchen. We stopped talking about it after a while because saying it out loud made it more real. We lived there for years, and nothing ever escalated beyond sounds and sensations. No objects flew. No one was touched. But the house never felt empty. It always felt shared. Even now, long after we moved away, I can close my eyes and hear those barefoot footsteps tearing across tile at 12:30 in the morning. I can still see the open doorway, the silent living room, the doorbell ringing to an empty house. And I still remember the look on that officer's face when he decided there were some calls he wasn't paid enough to answer. Look, if you're still watching, you already know what this channel is. No jump scares, no fake drama, just real stories about real people who survive things most of us can't even imagine. And that's scarier than any movie could ever be. If you want more of this raw, unfiltered truth, told the way it deserves to be told, subscribe to Lacuna Noir. We're not here to waste your time. We're here to tell the stories that actually matter. Thanks for listening. Now go get some sleep, if you can.